I'm making today also a third attempt to video a lecture. The first two attempts have blown up on me spectacularly. One time because it crashed actually the Blackboard site, and last time because trying to use the camera on my computer and show a PowerPoint presentation at the same time proved too much for the hamster who powers my computer. So we're going to try now a third time with old-fashioned video technology. So this will be posted on the website for you. This is also part of the stuff that I use for when I teach the online version of the class. Okay, if you're finishing up the maps, no problem. Just take your time. I'll collect any that are still hanging around. I just passed them out early today because we had so many people here early, and also because we didn't do them last week. I didn't want to make sure we didn't spend too much time on it this morning. What I want to talk about this week is we're shifting focus. We're moving from our discussion of the, so you might say, Asian-centric world of around 1500 to a period of transition. That is, if you start with the world in 1500, where Asia seems to have the most significant sort of administrative, economic, and technological capacities and benefits and advantages, starting in the early 1500s, you start to see the balance of power in the world shift. Then between about 1500 and 1750, this process of transition is going to be ongoing, eventually speeding up quite significantly from the middle of the 1600s on. And what we're going to be looking at is a movement of power that is in terms of wealth, political power, military power, technological capability, away from Asia towards northwestern Europe. And it has to do with a variety of things. Some within Asia, some within Europe, changing sort of technological capacities, changing power relationships, and ultimately the inclusion of what we will come to call the Atlantic world in the global economy. All of these are going to represent profound shifts in how power is distributed around the world. So that's my sort of outline of where we're going in these next two talks. And I've given up here some keywords and some ideas just for you to keep in mind if you want to jot them down now, especially the ones in bold. But I'll be coming back to these, don't worry, throughout the lecture, and they're also nearly all of them found in your book as well. And what I'd like to do is sort of take it in two parts. Talk about the Indian Ocean and the Portuguese, and talk about the Atlantic world, and in particular the Spanish and then the English in the Atlantic world. Before we get to talking about this European expansion, though, of the late 1400s, early 1500s, I want to talk about a couple of the sort of precursors to it, a couple of the underlying conditions or foundations for this expansion. There are several, and I think it's a good thing to sort of reiterate them before we get into comparing these expansions. The primary movers of this expansion in and around 1500 are Spain and Portugal. That is, again, two countries here, the Iberian Peninsula in southwestern Europe. Two countries which were significant rivals for especially maritime and commercial power. They were also two countries who realized by the end of the 1400s, the Portuguese first and then the Spanish, that a fundamental component, a fundamental part of, you might say, national power, national strength, you might today call it national security, a fundamental component of that was economic security. And in particular, a dominance in trade. That was a key to, you might say, sort of enhancing their own capabilities, their military capabilities, their political weight within Europe as a whole. The Portuguese were really sort of the first to realize this, because Spain, up until 1492, was in this process of what was called the Reconquista, or the reconquest, gradually driving out the Islamic dynasties which had ruled Spain for several hundred years. That process is only complete in the 1480s and early 1490s. In the 1440s and 1450s, the Portuguese already had begun to think about how controlling more of the trade that came in and out of Europe, especially the very wealthy trade from Asia, would benefit them. as I said, they're thinking a lot about their own national security, a lot about their own sort of economic might. After the 1450s, they're thinking about another thing as well. And I mentioned this briefly the other day. They're thinking about the fact that the traditional routes to Asia, the traditional ports that brought goods from Asia into the Mediterranean, into, and ultimately to northwestern Europe, that these ports were gradually falling under the control of the Ottoman Empire, this Islamic Empire. Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans extend their power throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and by the early 1500s, by about 1520, have fully taken Cairo. So you can see that there is not just a sort of drive for economic security, but there's also a significant unwillingness to participate in, to see your own sort of national treasury being expended on goods whose shipment is enriching an Islamic empire. Spain and Portugal are both obviously very sort of Christian states. They are, we're pre-Reformation here, just a couple of decades off from the Reformation. You can see, for example, in Spain, in 1492, at the completion of this reconquest of Spain, one of the first things that the new Spanish government, the government of Ferdinand and Isabella, does in 1492, besides it's more than Columbus, they expel all Jews and Muslims from Spain unless they convert. And even if they convert, they're going to be regarded as very suspicious characters in Spain. So you have this sort of desire to sort of reaffirm a Christian sort of solidarity, an economic solidarity against the rising Ottoman Empire. That's something that's playing into this as well.
What year was that document?
Which document?
The expulsion of...
Well, it's not really a document, but the decree is 1492. All Muslims and Jews who do not convert to Christianity are expelled from Spain. In Portugal, in the early 1400s, this desire for trade, this desire to sort of boost Portuguese control over trade, is spearheaded by, in particular, a member of the royal family, a man named Prince Henry. Henry is an oddity in European monarchies at the time. He's the younger son. He's not directly in line to inherit the throne. He doesn't spend all of his time plotting how to kill his older brother, which makes him, as I said, sort of an outlier among European monarchical families at the time. He instead throws his own sort of interest and his own sort of influence into building up Portugal's maritime capacity. And he does a couple of things. The most prominent is that he puts together, at a place called Sagres, S-A-G-R-E-S, on the very southwestern tip of Portugal, jutting out into the Atlantic, he puts together a maritime academy. Maritime seagoing, seafaring, shipping, you might say. Yeah, exactly. It is designed to bring about both technological and navigational innovations in the Portuguese fleet, the Portuguese merchant fleet and the Portuguese navy. This is Prince Henry, who is sometimes called Henry the Navigator. And you can still go to this site at Sagres in southwestern Portugal, and you can see the remains of this sort of complex that he had built there, these limestone walls. There's this, I think it's now sort of a replica of this enormous compass, or sort of representation of a compass that's built in limestone, sort of embedded in the ground. What Henry does is he basically brings together people from throughout Europe and even some people who have sailed to the eastern Mediterranean and had contact with people from the Indian Ocean. He brings together sailors from Genoa and Venice. He brings together people who've had access to or have witnessed some of these Chinese innovations, like the magnetic compass, like the axial rudder. And at Sagres, they throw themselves into doing two things. First, building a better vessel for the Portuguese to use. And second, accumulating much more knowledge about how to sail outside of the Mediterranean and the immediate North Atlantic. What the Portuguese start to do and something that the Spanish will copy at the end of the century, is the Portuguese start to send exploratory voyages down the western coast of Africa. One of the things that they are trying to figure out is particular how to sail along the coast here, how to sail in what can be very terrible weather. This area here, off the western part of Africa, this is where hurricanes originate in the Atlantic, for example. This is an area which every summer and fall is enormously turbulent. It's a place where you see, for example, jet streams, trade winds blowing from the Atlantic, blowing from the southern Atlantic to the northeast. It's where you have these weather systems kicking up. And the Portuguese just sort of kept pushing the boundaries. How far can we go? By the end of the 1480s, they will be sailing around the southern tip of Africa, and by the 1490s, into the Indian Ocean. And ultimately to, in the voyage of Vasco da Gama, at the end of the 1490s, to India itself. We'll come back to talking about da Gama in a couple of minutes. The other thing that the Portuguese are doing is that they're working on shipbuilding. And they come up with a new type of, a new design for ship. It's a ship they're going to call the Caravel. C-A-R-A-V-E-L. The Caravel.
Spanish or
Portuguese. The Spanish will improve on this. The Spanish version will be called galleon, a galleon. This is the basic template for shipping in Europe for the next 200 years. Larger and larger versions of this. The original caravels aren't that big. They're 85 to 100 feet in length. They've got square sails and some triangular sails, like those Latin sails we discussed. They're built fairly sturdily. They're very heavy. They have things like axial rudders, compartmentalized hull to ensure against damage and sinking. They have one further element. This is the thing that's going to set the Caravel apart from even those Chinese vessels that Zheng He had used in the early 1400s. That is, they are well armed. Yes?
Is there a problem with piracy?
Well, not really in this part of the world, no. I mean, they're going to be well armed for when they get to this part of the world, the Indian Ocean. Up here, no. No, I mean, this was still, lots of people looked at the Portuguese crazy trying to sail around Africa because the Atlantic sort of wind systems and meteorology of the Atlantic was still so poorly understood. But the Portuguese, like Europeans as a whole, are experiencing a revolution in what you might call metallurgy. This is something that's not going on in Asia. In fact, there is an armaments revolution, you might say, going on in Europe. People are building lighter, more mobile field artillery pieces, cannons. By the end of the 1400s, you'll start to see full-fledged battles in Europe featuring field artillery pieces. And the Portuguese put small cannons on these caravels. They're not very large, but they don't have to be, because they're all that's required. Remember, out here in the Indian Ocean, as we discussed, there's no navy. There's no defense force. There had been Zheng He's fleets in the early 1400s, but those had disappeared. There's no deterrent. There's nothing there to make anyone think twice about sailing in and potentially taking over. Portuguese aren't thinking about taking over yet. But one of the things that the use of cannons will do is it will allow them quite quickly to transition from trading to actual conquest. So you have the putting together of this maritime knowledge, this sailing knowledge. You have the incorporation of new designs, or what to the Portuguese are innovations in shipbuilding to produce the caravel. The result is, by the 1480s, you have Bartholomew Diaz sailing around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. By 1497, 1498, you have, of course, the famous voyage of Vasco da Gama, where he fails, as I mentioned before, to listen to navigators about the monsoons, but does eventually fetch up in the southern part of India, where he trades for black pepper and brings it back. And this is where things change for the Portuguese. Originally, the idea was, let's see how quickly and efficiently we can get out to the Indian Ocean, trade, and come back. that this will perhaps give us a leg up on sort of, selling black pepper to the rest of Europe. What they didn't realize was just how tremendous a profit there was to be made. Economic historians who trace the relationship of the Indian Ocean to Europe in the 1400s have basically settled on the idea that a good like pepper coming from the southern part of India, if you took simply sort of a pound of pepper, that it would pass through 9 separate transactions on its way to northwestern Europe. That is, somebody would grow it, sell it to somebody who's going to trade it at the coast. They might sell it to somebody in Aden, would then sell it to somebody headed for Cairo, somebody headed to Genoa, somebody headed to Paris, then somebody headed to northern France, to Lille or someplace like that. So you have this progression. And every time, of course, the price goes up. Everybody takes a little bit of their cut along the way. So the price that it's finally sold for at its ultimate destination is multiple steps up from what it was bought for. What the Gama realizes is that he goes and he buys for cash pepper, comes back to Europe. The price of pepper in Europe at that point, if he sells the pepper then, will give him a 4,000% profit. That is, it's 4,000% increase over what he bought it for, which is an eye-opening figure, to say the least. And what the Portuguese realize is that not only can they make a lot of money by cutting out all these sort of middlemen and sort of intermediaries on the route from Asia to Europe, but also if they can ensure that they are the only ones bringing this pepper into Europe, they can keep the price high and make an enormous profit. And even if they lower the price a little bit, what the Portuguese ultimately realize is if you're making 4,000% on pepper at the price that they're given in Europe, you can lower your price a little bit less than the market price of pepper. Even if people somehow manage to get pepper in otherwise. If you're willing to, really make a sacrifice and take, say, a 3,700% profit as opposed to 4,000% profit, you can lower your price. You can undersell everybody else in Europe with getting pepper traditional ways. You can dominate the pepper market. You can dominate the spice market. The key is you've got to make sure that no one else can do what you do, which is no one else can go out to the Indian Ocean, get access to spice ports, and bring these spices home for sale. So for the Portuguese, there's this fundamentally sort of, there's this unique opportunity, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take control of the supply of this valuable good into Europe, ensure that you are the only ones who are able to buy it at cost or buy it at sort of wholesale prices in Asia, bring it back, mark it up significantly, and still undersell everyone else in Europe. That's what the Portuguese realized after Vasco da Gama. And starting in the early 1500s, the Portuguese start to send larger fleets out to the Indian Ocean, fleets of these caravels, which are intent not only on trading, but ensuring that nobody else is trading black pepper, or that as few people as possible are trading black pepper and other valuable spices along traditional routes where these goods will somehow get to Europe. The Portuguese basically want to control this valuable trade. What they found in the Indian Ocean is an existing, sophisticated, both technologically and, you might say, financially, trade network with all these interconnections. People on the coast of East Africa, Southern Arabia, India, all the way into Indonesia and Malaysia. You have this interconnected economy that works very well. What the Portuguese want to do is basically impose their control upon it. They are very careful. They do not necessarily want to transform the entire Indian Ocean region. What they want to do is basically install themselves at the top. exert control, but exert a fairly loose control, so that they will make money, and the operation of these various sorts of networks within the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia will continue fairly unaltered or unimpeded. That's what the Portuguese are up to. What the Portuguese do is they start to come in and, using their armored caravels, they start to enforce who can use certain trade routes and who can buy certain goods. Basically, they start saying you can only ship spices in the Indian Ocean if you are in a Portuguese ship or in a ship that the Portuguese have sort of designated as moving goods for them. If you want to trade at all, I mean, you've got to keep the goods moving up and down the coasts of places like India. If you want to trade at all in anything, you've basically got to pay a fee to the Portuguese. The Portuguese come up with something called the cartaz, C-A-R-T-A-Z, the cartaz, which is basically a tax or a fee, which if you want to ship goods in the Indian Ocean now, you've got to give to the Portuguese. So the Portuguese are able to maintain their fleet in the Indian Ocean, maintain their presence by basically charging people a toll almost for shipping, by forcibly restricting who can sell or who can ship certain goods. Now the Portuguese, as I said, they're handling this fairly carefully. One of the things that, to the advantage of the Portuguese, is this. Sure, they come in and say, okay, we want to buy all the pepper. And we've got, you know, we've got the guns. We've got this navy, by the way, so, you know, we'll blockade this port if we don't get a chance to buy up all the pepper. But the other thing is that because the Portuguese can make such a huge profit back home, they don't need to come in and basically loot these spices. They don't need to come in and basically put a gun to people's heads and say, we're taking everything. Because the Portuguese understand that this is a functioning trade network. And if you come in and you loot it, you're going to, in essence, you might get some value for a little while, but in the long term, you're not going to get a lot out of it. You need this network to function, to move goods, to bring things to the coast, to give people the ability to trade goods, to give people sort of a willingness to work with the Portuguese. So the Portuguese can buy it at sort of, you know, fairly standard prices because, of course, the price when you get back to Europe is so much greater. So what you can do is basically, you know, sort of not alienate a lot of these traders and instead sort of participate in trade. Yes, exert your influence over shipping and what goods can leave the Indian Ocean headed for Europe, but you're not cutting into people's profits. You're not alienating huge swaths of the merchant community.
Yeah, so going back, you said when they reach Europe, so basically all Europe, they make a 4,000% profit on pepper alone.
Yeah, well, that is the difference between the price of pepper in India and the price of pepper in, say, Lisbon.
Okay.
It's 4,000% difference.
All right,
Yeah.
so I just want to make sure.
Okay, yeah, no, so there's a huge difference. It's a valuable good. It's one that lots of people want to buy. So it's and you can control the supply. If you're the Portuguese, you can come out here and basically control the pepper comes to Europe under Portuguese supervision, and that's it.
How are they keeping this from India, letting them know that, hey, we're making $4,000 profit on you, where India could obviously raise the prices to
Well,
Rica? I mean,
the Portuguese have the guns, too. This is the other thing. The Portuguese have the ability. The Portuguese will, in 1510, actually take over a small city-state, a small island called Goa, G-O-A, on the western coast of India, just south of what's now Mumbai. And in fact, they're not going to give it back until about 1961, actually. In fact, India has to invade Goa in 1961, and I think 4 or 5 Portuguese soldiers are killed. It's the end of the Portuguese-Indian Empire. But even after Britain leaves India in 1947, a small little piece of Goa is, small little piece of Western India is still Portuguese. They do go in there and they oust forcibly the Islamic Sultan, who's the head of that city-state, basically because they need a base. So they demonstrate that they have the power. But I mean, for these merchants, it's not necessarily like they're taking a huge sort of hit on the prices. The Portuguese are still paying pretty good prices. And, you know, the Portuguese are coming in, and as I said, the Portuguese are playing this very sort of careful are playing out this very sort of careful strategy, which is that they are determined not to disrupt the network, the golden goose. Don't do anything to endanger this. I mean, one of the things is the Portuguese will take over Goa. The Portuguese will extend their control. They will take over, ultimately out here in Indonesia, they'll take over a port called Malacca, M-A-L-A-C-C-A. And ultimately, by the mid-1500s, the Portuguese will be trading all the way to Japan and southern China. But they're very careful. Apart from the takeover of Goa in particular, where they installed someone called a viceroy in 1510. The first viceroy is the Duke of Albuquerque. Don't worry about who it is. That's just an interesting name. What they're doing is they're trying to sort of, as I said, sort of piggyback onto this existing system. And in some ways, because they are doing this, they're not going to try and change, sort of root and branch, that is, fundamentally change these areas that they come in control of, or these areas where they have significant economic and military influence. There will be a great deal of Portuguese, and you might say sort of in the larger sense, Christian or Catholic influence on this part of India in particular. But it's not necessarily done with sort of huge amount of force. The Portuguese are not coming in to do forcible conversions. Because that's another way in which you wind up alienating people who you need for trade. There will be Portuguese Jesuit priests and others who in the middle of the 1500s will come out. When we talked about Akbar, some of them will make their way to Akbar's court. Some of these Portuguese Jesuits, the most famous is a man named Francis Xavier, will go to China and to Japan. They will, in some cases, turn out to be sort of much more enamored of Asian culture than they had thought. They will write very intricate letters back to Rome, talking a lot about Asia and talking very little about how much converting they've done, which causes some consternation in Rome. But the Jesuits sort of have their own agenda out in Asia, which is largely about accumulating knowledge. So you have a Christian presence, but it's not one where Indians are being forcibly converted. You get a bunch of Christian converts on the west coast of India. It comes about a couple of ways. You don't have a large Portuguese presence out there. At its height, you probably have about 2,000 Portuguese in Goa and Malacca combined. That is sort of permanently stationed there, permanently living there. Then you've got sailors, people in the Portuguese Navy, traders, and maybe officials coming back and forth, clerics, priests coming back and forth, but not a huge presence. This is not an empire of settlement or of territorial conquest. Apart from Goa and Malacca, a very light footprint for the Portuguese. What I'm setting up here is a contrast with what's going to happen with the Spanish and then the English in the Americas. Largely due to the different sorts of economic systems that pre-exist colonial takeover and that are constructed by the colonial states. In the western part of India, as I said, you do have conversions. You have intermarriage that goes on. You have people within Hinduism, same reason some had converted to Islam centuries before, which is they find themselves within Hinduism as sort of the lower castes or even outcasts within an existing social system. And conversion to Islam or to Christianity gives them that sort of new identity. It takes them out of that existing social system and their existing sort of social predicament, you might say. If you look at if you look at Goa today, if you look at parts of western India today, you find enormous numbers of people, even typically in, well, there used to be phone books, I don't know if there's phone books anymore, but people with Portuguese last names. There's lots of people named De Souza and Fernandez and Oliveira and Gouveia. In the 1990s, the Indian Defense Minister was a man named George Fernandez. You might not have thought, immediately that's the Indian, Prime Minister. He was a member of, actually, he was a Hindu. This conversion sometimes only lasted for a generation or two. But you have a significant presence, a Portuguese sort of cultural influence. You have Christianity. The western part of India is the most Christian part of India. the area around Mumbai and Goa. You also have a significant change to Indian cuisine. One of the things that's introduced by the Portuguese is the Portuguese introduced into Indian cooking a much spicier element. This may sound sort of contradictory, but traditional Indian cooking had actually been, and especially under the Mughal Empire, had been much more about almost sort of perfumed foods, creating things that had fruit and rice in them. And if you go to an Indian restaurant, you order something called a biryani. Anyone ever had one? You know, sometimes they'll have raisins and other things in there, yogurt. What the Portuguese bring in is they bring in meat, because as people convert to Christianity, they become meat eaters as they leave Hinduism, many of them, and they also bring in enormously spicy combinations. That is, the Portuguese bring in a fondness for very hot. So if you go and have something like chicken vindaloo at an Indian restaurant, what you're having is a combination of Indian and Portuguese influences. If you go and you get chicken tikka masala, you get something that's basically invented by the British, because they found that Indian food was not very like it. So it's, again, the sort of way in which even culinary traditions reflect this larger history. So you have the Portuguese come in. They're not necessarily going to try to sort of, how to put it, inflict themselves culturally, militarily. The Mughal Empire continues. I mean, the height of Akbar's reign from the 1550s to the early 1600s is at a time in which the Portuguese are controlling an enormous amount of the commercial traffic in the Indian Ocean. Akbar doesn't mind. You have the Portuguese sending an annual tribute to Akbar, as other sort of coastal rulers and princes will do. The Mughal Empire is all about land. They're like the Ming. They're about land. Land is how you measure status. Land is how you measure wealth. The emperor owns the land. The emperor is not necessarily worried about trade. All the Portuguese have to do is a couple of things. They pay tribute, and they help make sure that every year shipping can leave northwestern India from the port called Surat, S-U-R-A-T, going on the pilgrimage to Mecca. That is, that Indian Muslims can make the Hajj, for the pilgrimage to Mecca. They ensure that those ships are sort of, left alone. Those ships, I don't think, had to pay the Kartas. But that's basically all that the Mughal Emperor required. Akbar, at least, was happy to welcome these various sort of Portuguese figures, like the Jesuit priests, to his court in the 1570s and 1580s. So it's a very light footprint. It's an effort to sort of not disrupt too much an existing and enormously profitable commercial system. That's the thing we need to remember about what the Portuguese are doing. Any questions so far? We're covering a lot of ground. Okay, let's start thinking about the Spanish. The Spanish are, I got one of my slides out of order here, pardon me for a second, but this, by the way, I didn't think I had this map, but I did. This shows you sort of the routes which, the sort of stations, the trade ports the Portuguese will work to establish. Lisbon, of course, the capital of Portugal, Goa here on the west coast of India, Malacca here in what's now Malaysia, Macau, which is an island off the southern part of China. Macau is sort of the Portuguese Hong Kong. They held on to Macau longer than they did even Goa. Macau goes back to Chinese control in the early 1990s, and had at the time, I don't know, it still does, but it still had a reputation as being sort of the, if Hong Kong was sort of like the New York City, you might say, of China at the time. Macau was sort of the Vegas of China. Lots of gambling, lots of casinos. So the idea that sort of, Macau was a place where people could get away with a lot of things. I'm not quite sure that that still holds now. Nagasaki, southern Japan. Nagasaki will, in the 1500s and early 1600s, be where European traders will attempt to make inroads into the Japanese market. Ultimately, as we'll talk about, in the middle of the 1600s, Japan will basically close up. Except for the Dutch. The Dutch will be allowed to continue to live on this island off of Nagasaki and trade a couple times a year with the Japanese. But otherwise, everybody else is kicked out. We're coming to have to talk about Japan in a little bit. bit. But what you see here, this is line extending here. It starts over here in Acapulco and winds up here in Manila. This is important because this side sort of represents a transition. This is the direct connection coming from the Spanish Americas into Asia, and the most important thing being carried on this sort of trade route is silver. This silver is enabling a greater amount of commerce in Asia. It's also, as I mentioned last time, contributing, especially in the later parts of the Ming Empire, latter days of the Ming Empire, to inflation within China. That is a place where there hadn't been a lot of sort of hard currency or precious metal going around. It's all of a sudden flooded with it from the mid-1500s on. So we're going to talk now about what the Spanish do in the Americas, how the Spanish end up there, and how, in particular, the Spanish experience in the Americas contrasts with, both compares and contrasts with what goes on in the Portuguese Indian Ocean, or the Portuguese Asian Empire. Any questions about any of this stuff? Okay, some of this, I mean, again, some of this may be very familiar to you, but some of it, especially this comparative sort, I'd like to make a little bit more sort of pronounced. The big difference is this. The thing that defines what the Portuguese Empire in Asia is going to look like from what the Spanish Empire in the Americas is going to look like is what's there previously. That is, the Spanish, by agreements hammered out in the 1490s, including arbitration by the Pope, the Spanish, there's a line drawn down the middle of the Atlantic. And basically the rivalry between Portugal and Spain is settled with the essence that the Portuguese can go east from this line and the Spanish can go west. The line actually cuts through, this map's not great to scale, but the line actually cuts through this part of South America. Anybody know what that is?
Brazil.
That's Brazil, but they, of course, they speak Portuguese. So this line that's drawn in the 1490s, it's actually two lines. I think it's 1492 and 1494, if I remember correctly. There's two agreements dividing up sort of, where Spain can go and where Portugal can go. The Spanish, what they find, they head to the Americas, of course, convinced that they're going to find their own route to Asia. They don't, as we all know. But what they do find there convinces them that there is money to be made, that there are economic benefits to be gained from the Americas. But what they find there is vastly different from what the Portuguese know exists and find exists in the Indian Ocean. That is, the Portuguese have a functioning, not just a functioning, but really sort of, the most profitable commercial network that exists in the early 1500s. What the Spanish find is a largely agricultural, settled population in Central and South America, one that has an abundance of natural resources, has basically large, you might almost say, sort of city-states at the hearts of empires, like what's now Mexico City, the capital of the Aztec Empire. But they don't have an existing trade network. And they're not producing the sort of goods that the Portuguese are able to get out of the Indian Ocean. They're not producing these goods that even in small quantities can bring large profits, like spices, like silk and Chinese porcelain, for example. Instead, sorry?
What year did they land Central?
Well, we get 1492 in the Caribbean. Between 1492 and 1519, the Spanish consolidate their position in various Caribbean islands, including Cuba. And then ultimately in 1519, with the expedition led by Fernando Cortez, they will launch into Aztec Mexico. But this is the first thing, that the Spanish find something they feel they can profit from, but it's a very different thing. They find natural resources. They find large populations, settled populations. They find populations where they can potentially sort of make inroads in dividing the population or playing on existing animosities within the populations. But the big thing is they find resources that can be extracted. They find land that can be used for cultivation. That's the big thing. And that is going to drive the model. That if you have in the Portuguese Empire, it's a commercial model and trade model, What you ultimately have created in the Americas is what you might call the plantation model. That is, the Spanish colonies in the Americas, from the start, are based on the extraction of natural resources and the use of natural resources, especially sort of arable land, cultivatable land, for things like growing sugar, as well as, of course, for tobacco, which they find there. So you have this dramatic difference between what's there in the Americas and what's there in the Indian Ocean. And that's going to dramatically shape how colonization is going to go forward. In the first place, the Spanish Empire in the Americas is one that's going to be built on conquest. If we look here at the creation of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, what you see here is that the sort of the Caribbean and even parts of Florida by about 1511. Then you have the expansion starting in 1519 into Mexico and ultimately into Central America. With the relatively small Cortez and a few hundred soldiers, administrators, sailors, a couple of priests coming into Aztec Mexico and ultimately being able to take control. They're initially able to make, you might say, sort of an incursion, because they are in fact welcomed by people living along the coast. In coastal Mexico, people living in what had been, for example, Mayan Mexico, people who don't like the Aztecs. The Aztecs in their capital city, it was called Tenochtitlan, don't worry about the name, but basically where present-day Mexico City is. The Aztecs were, at times, a brutal regime. Aztecs practiced things like human sacrifice. They weren't the only ones, but they were fairly sort of pronounced in their practice. The Aztec capital drew an enormous amount of resources from the countryside. Basically sort of demanded tribute in food, tribute in labor. So there was resentment. There existed. When Cortez arrives, Cortez doesn't immediately find a hostile population. What Cortez finds is, in fact, people who are willing to guide him, to assist, provide some food and resources to his soldiers and his men, ultimately able to do some translation for him. When Cortez goes to Mexico City, when he finally gets to sort of the heart of the Aztec Empire, to see Montezuma, the last Aztec emperor, I mean, Cortez still does not have an enormously powerful force. He picked up some support in the Central American countryside, in the Mexican countryside, but he doesn't have an enormous amount of support. And that's the thing that we have to remember. This is about conquest, first of all. Conquest means the meeting of people. It means the interaction of people. And that's the second thing about this. Unlike in the case of the Portuguese Indian Ocean, what happens in the Americas is really in human history, almost a unique environmental or biological event. That is, it is the physical meeting of groups of people from very separate, what you might almost call biospheres, from very different environments. People in Europe, when compared to people in the Americas, had been exposed and in fact were sort of crawling with germs and parasites, diseases to which no one in the Americas had any previous exposure and therefore any immunity. Because of existing trade between Asia and Europe, through the Middle East, through North Africa, a lot of these diseases had circulated. That's how the Black Death works, coming out of Asia into Europe in the 1300s. Europeans and Asians alike are exposed to fairly similar strains of disease. It's why the Portuguese can go to Asia, or at least coastal Asia, fairly easily. It's why the Portuguese can, and later other Europeans, like slave traders, can wind up in parts of coastal Africa. They can't go inland. That's a big thing, especially in Western Africa, because of malaria. That's something to which they have not been exposed in Europe. But they can stay on the coast and sort of reduce the impact that malaria will have on European traders. Similarly, when Portuguese and Indians meet, when Portuguese and Indonesians and Chinese and Japanese meet, It's not this clash of people from absolutely fundamentally different biospheres. And the germs, the parasites, the infections that the Europeans are carrying into Central America are more powerful and are so foreign that, of course, they quickly and horrifically impact the local population, starting with the people whom Cortez had first met. That is, the key, ultimately, people that, there's a man named Jared Diamond who's written a famous book about guns, germs, and steel. What was it that enabled the Spanish in particular to come into Central and South America and knock off the Aztec and Inca empires in such short order? I think, if anything, he underplays the biological aspect of it. If you look at the population of basically Aztec Mexico and Central America, demographers who studied this say that they're looking at a population of roughly 25 million people in 1500. Excuse me, in 1520 in this part of the world. Sorry, in Mexico, Central America, down almost to Panama. Yeah, if you look at the population of this part of the world in 1520, you've got about 25 million people, indigenous Americans. 25 years later, 1545, so basically a generation later, the population of indigenous Americans is 2 million. You've had over 90% mortality. Now, you've had deaths for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is disease. And out of diseases, the biggest one is smallpox, which is easily transmitted, something which many Europeans carried but didn't realize they had sort of acquired immunity to. That they lived with a low level of all these sorts of diseases. But even at a low level, they could wipe out entire populations, and especially in places like the Aztec capital, where you have a settled, fairly crowded urban center. Smallpox could move very quickly. That is, smallpox spores could be transferred from one person to another by itching, by coughing, by rubbing up against someone. One of the early treatments that the Aztecs tried was they tried to put people in water to treat the sores, but then one person would come out of the water and somebody else would go into the water, and they'd pick up. Or they'd be exposed to smallpox that way. A similar thing will happen in the Incan Empire, where the expedition led by Francisco Pizarro will fairly quickly, in the 1530s, come to dominate this very wealthy, especially rich in natural resources, this very wealthy empire. The one thing I would say about this, and the one sort of historical interpretive note that might be made, is that there are at times people who will look at this and say, well, this is genocide. I am reluctant to call this genocide for one particular reason, is that genocide carries with it a particular intent. That is, what happens, for example, in Rwanda is a genocide. What happens in the Holocaust is a genocide. I would not call this a genocide. I would call it an environmental or biological catastrophe. But the Spanish themselves did not arrive saying, thank goodness everybody got your smallpox, good, we'll go. There was not this understanding. I mean, there's no understanding of the germ theory of disease here, until the late 19th century in the world. Instead, many from Spain, many as part of this expedition, took this as sort of, God's providential gift to them. That obviously Spain was meant to conquer, Spain was meant to hold this territory because so many indigenous people seemed to die once the Spanish arrived. So you have this situation where you have a massive and catastrophic meeting of people from two very different biological spheres. Genocide, now you can talk about in the 1700s, and some people say, some historians talk about, well, there are British administrators and others who knew by that point how smallpox worked and attempted to distribute, blankets that had been used by smallpox victims to Native Americans and things like that. That, I would say, is someone who has a genocidal intent to wipe out a certain group of people. The Spanish don't have that. So again, I would hesitate to call this necessarily a genocide, more to call it, as I said, sort of an environmental or biological catastrophe. The result is, of course, to give the Spanish control of massive parts of Central and South America within 3 decades. That is, between 1519 and 1550, Spanish control over not just the Caribbean and Central America, but Spanish control over all of South America is extensive. The only part that will remain sort of outside is Brazil, but that will eventually sort of get brought in because of intermarriage by the end of the 1500s between the Portuguese and Spanish thrones. But what you have is conquest. In order to capture resources, you need to capture the territory that holds those resources. The Spanish believed, they thought they understood from various native peoples, even in the Caribbean they talked to, that there were fabulous cities made of gold and silver. The famous El Dorado that everyone wanted to capture. That there were not only sort of precious metals like silver and gold, but the Spanish discovered, of course, enormous amounts of tobacco in the Caribbean. They discovered that especially in the Caribbean and in Brazil, you had some of the best sort of environmental conditions for growing sugarcane. Something the Portuguese have been experimenting with in the Azores and islands off the coast of Western Africa, but they had never seen this sort of scale or this sort of massive an opportunity. Plantation economies are, in essence, sort of economies of scale. They're not like spice or trade or commercial economies where even sort of a small amount of a good can give you a profit. You've got to extract a lot. It requires a lot of labor, a lot of transport, and a lot of the good itself. Usually you're trying to get goods that will be for mass consumption that can be purchased fairly cheaply, and you're going to make money off of that mass consumption. As we'll discuss later on, the primary way in which you're going to ensure that you make money is by eliminating the cost of labor. That's what we'll be talking about. We're starting a little bit on Thursday and then extending into next week, which is the introduction of African slave labor, West African slave labor, into the Atlantic world by the early 1500s. But at least initially, for the Portuguese, you have this expansion, excuse me, for the Spanish, you have expansion, you have the realization on the part of the Spanish that they're going to make a profit here. It's going to come out of extraction of natural resources. That leads to conquest. Again, setting it apart from the Portuguese example, it leads ultimately to environmental impact. Not only is the indigenous population basically wiped out in much of Central and South America, but over the course of the 1500s, you're going to have massive in-migration from Europe and from West Africa. People who are voluntary migrants, people who you might say are involuntary migrants. But a dramatic demographic change. In fact, in the 1570s, the Spanish government is going to have to put a cap on the number and forbid, in fact, people from leaving Spain to go to the quote-unquote New World to find their fortunes or seek, a new life. Mostly because so many people are leaving, the cost of labor in Spain is going up dramatically. That is, it's getting harder and harder to find people to work, especially in the fields of harvests and things like that. So you have this, in the 1570s, I think around 1571, the Spanish put at least a temporary halt to the movement of people across the Atlantic. So already you can see that while the Spanish and the Portuguese are both motivated by profit and by economic advantage, well, they both take advantage of new shipbuilding technologies. The Spanish take advantage of investigations they've done into how the trade winds and general sort of weather patterns work in the Atlantic. Then you also have these differences. Based on what is there in each case, the Portuguese are going to preside over a commercial empire, the Spanish are going to preside over a significant plantation economy. Any questions about this? There is one other element that they share, and this is the last point I'm going to make today, and I'm going to leave it. Both of these, because we're going to talk a little bit next time about the English and Dutch examples, but both of these colonial empires, the Spanish and the Portuguese, both of them are very much like the societies they come from. They're very hierarchical. Spain and Portugal are places where, of course, there's monarchy, there is landed wealth, and there's the church. three things which very much support the idea of social hierarchy, or the reinforced social hierarchy.
Say it again, please.
Sorry, you've got in both of the Spain and Portugal, you've got monarchies, you've got places where landed wealth is enormously important, and where the church, especially the post-Reformation church, the post sort of 1540, 1550 Catholic church. These are places that are very much hierarchical societies, top-down societies. And their empires are going to resemble that. That is, they will establish what are called viceroyalties, both the Portuguese in Goa and in Asia, the Spanish in Central and South America. These will be regions that will be governed by appointed governors, sometimes military commanders, sometimes administrators, who are ultimately responsible back to Spain and Portugal. That is, there's going to be a lot of centralized control. Policy for the Americas, Portuguese decisions about what's going to go on in the Indian Ocean, those ultimately emanate from Europe. Decisions about, and are sort of mirrored because you'll have, especially in the Spanish in the Americas, a very hierarchical structure for the church in the Americas, which will respond back to, or which will be very much driven by, the very hierarchical Spanish church. The Portuguese less so, largely because the Portuguese, it's a lot of the Jesuits who, in some senses, though they are supposed to defend hierarchy, in many cases wind up sort of operating out of hierarchy. But the current Pope is a Jesuit, by the way, which may explain why he has perhaps gone in a direction different than everyone anticipated. But the upshot is that they are very sort of slow-moving bureaucratic empires. They are ones where decisions are made slowly and decisions are made sort of top-down. It means, however, that these are empires, at least in the Spanish case in the Americas, that are going to be under colonial control, where colonial control is going to be maintained well into the 19th century, into the 1820s, into the 1830s. After, for example, English colonial control or British colonial control is over in North America. What we're going to pick up next time is talking about the British and the Dutch, their versions of colonialism, and how those versions of colonialism help to sort of predict the types of empires that they will produce in North America and, in fact, in India. All right, we'll leave it there today. So much shorter version today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you.